I wanted to point out that there is an evolutionary force haunting this discussion, and I think it's worth just noting where it is and what kind of role it's playing. So, Douglas, when you point to this image of the boy washing up on the Turkish beach and this having a disproportionate impact on the conversation, there's an obvious evolutionary fact here, which is that none of us have ancestors that would ever have faced an image from thousands of miles away that would have been photorealistic and represented the tragic death of a child. In other words, to the extent that you saw a tragically dead child, it was a tragically dead child that was in your environment, and therefore you would have some pseudo-statistical way of analyzing what its implications were. But you can't analyze a photograph in isolation at that distance because you have no idea whether it's a common phenomenon or a rare phenomenon. You're not wired to detect the difference. And terrorism itself actually is based on this very error. When you hear that people have been blown up in some public situation, in some locale, you can't calibrate how much danger you're actually in. So the point is, if you are a force that cannot raise an army large enough to push a nation around, you might be able to push the nation around by psychologically manipulating it into overreacting. So just the same way a bee is not a threat to you, but your allergic reaction to its sting might be, you can cause a country to have an allergic reaction by utilizing the fact that the images of terrorism are much more powerful than the terrorists themselves are. So the fact that we are ancient creatures trying to navigate a modern landscape in which we have totally unrepresentative data, and then people who understand that the data is going to have effects on us employ game theory to cause us to have an emotional reaction to the question of immigration rather than a rational one. So I would argue we have to, in some sense, if you, as I do, believe that you must have borders, that they can't be open or you'll have a game theoretic failure of all of the successful policies within a country, but that immigration is desirable in some circumstances and should be allowed. If you're going to have that discussion and you're going to have a compassionate policy about immigration, it has to arrive out of a dispassionate discussion of the facts and how they interact. And all of this, in some sense, goes back to the question that Eric raises, which is why is it that nations, which I would argue evolutionarily are probably predisposed to xenophobia and to be resistant to immigration, are inviting it, and it has to do with this this pyramid scheme of, it's an economic pyramid scheme where you can solve a temporary economic problem by creating phony growth, which causes people to believe they are economically better positioned than they are. That is to say, that members of the nation feel that things are getting better because they have artificially gotten an influx of well-being that is really the result of the fact that someone has been invited into the economic ladder below them, but that can only go on so long. And so the whole thing is going to unravel ultimately, and the only solution to it is to have a dispassionate conversation about how to be compassionate about this issue. But we can't get there until we recognize we're people who have inherited limits on what we can perceive and understand based on who we were 10,000 years ago. We're just not equipped for the modern media environment.
So just to clarify, Bret, why can it not go on forever? Why doesn't the migrant simply become a new Australian or American and they replace you and then you die and then more migrants keep coming in and the country keeps growing?
Well, there's a
Half
couple
of this
reasons.
country has arrived since the Second World War.
Sure, but there's a question about how large the population can get. So something, I believe it is 50% of the protein in modern people is the result of the Haber-Bosch process, which takes inorganic nitrogen and brings it into the biological cycle by burning fossil fuels in order to make it biologically available. So the point is, our population is way above what the ecosystems could possibly support, even if they were agriculturally farmed intensively. What we're doing is we're bringing in nutrients that weren't in that system to begin with, inflating the population, and ultimately these systems aren't going to be able to handle it. Then there's also the question that Majid raises, which is there is a level of immigration at which the rate is low enough that assimilation is a natural consequence, that new immigrants find themselves better off by embracing the culture of the country that they're entering. But there's a point at which you've invited in so many people so quickly that what you effectively do is you create these subpopulations that retain their own distinct culture, and that creates an inevitable, I would argue, conditions for racism.
Yeah, I mean,
And extremism.
Yes.
Example of this is, I'm not in favor of no immigration. I'm in favor of caution and of being careful. And one of the reasons of that is because I see a lot of unexpected consequences. Let me give you one obvious example of the country that Majid just mentioned. Denmark, like most of Europe, had post-war immigration policies that basically invited guest workers in, and then the guest workers stayed, which they hadn't expected, and then various other things happened. Now, nobody was talking about Islam in this period. I mean, it wasn't in Britain until the Satanic Verses affair in 1989, when the fatwa was imposed on a British novelist by the Ayatollah, that we started talking about Islam in Britain, really. Yeah. And in Denmark, it didn't happen until 2005, when one newspaper editor, the editor of the culture section of Jyllands-Posten, discovered that in a set of children's books about the great religions, they couldn't find anyone to illustrate the one on Islam, because nobody was willing to draw pictures of Muhammad. And so this newspaper editor, the culture editor of the paper, commissioned 12 people who were prominent cartoonists in Denmark to do cartoons of Muhammad. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Some of them did ones that were saying the paper's provocative and unnecessarily provoking Muslims. On the back of that, of course, there were riots all over the Muslim world. Quite a lot of people were killed. There were burnings of the Danish embassy and so on. And I got caught up in a little bit of that. And I was in Denmark for the 10th anniversary of the cartoons in 2015. And I was telling Majid about this yesterday. There'd been an event on the 5th anniversary, but everyone who'd been at the 5th anniversary had been shot since the 5th anniversary, so it was hard to find people to speak at the 10th anniversary. And I and a couple of friends discovered we had headline billing, and it was only after realizing the situation with the 5th anniversary we realized why we were so prominent. But anyhow, this...
Gets funnier, this story.
No, the funny detail was, I discovered afterwards that both the US State Department and the British Foreign Office had told British and American nationals not to go anywhere near the Danish Parliament or the centre of Copenhagen on this day because of the possibility of an attack on our conference. And I was like, well, they didn't tell me that.
Hoping you got killed, Douglas.
Yeah, probably. But anyhow, but the point is I mention this because I spoke to a lot of MPs that day that was in the Danish Parliament because it was the only building in Denmark that they could guarantee the safety of the audience in. Okay.
Yeah. Just think about that for a minute, folks. Seriously.
And actually, ISIS called for an attack on the conference, it turned out, but they couldn't get anyone there in time. And anyhow, I spoke to a lot of Danish MPs that day, and I remember one of them from the centre-right party said to me, I said, what's your view on immigration now? And she said, I don't want any more immigrants from the Muslim world. And I said, isn't that a bit, isn't that a bit simplistic and so on? And her response was, look, all the polling shows that 99.5% of Muslims think that you shouldn't be allowed to publish cartoons of Muhammad. So for every 100 people we invite in, there'll be 99 and more who won't allow our free press to keep on operating in a free manner. So I'm not taking that risk. Now, you can decry that and disagree with it, but it's an argument that's worth thinking about.